Hello Astro subscribers, welcome back to another video in the layer system. This is a video about, this is a series about astrology and levels of perception that are associated with the different layers of the star chart. Basically, the star chart is divided up into many different layers, different levels of perception. You can look at the hours, you can look at the signs, you can look at the houses, you can look at the nakshatras, and it's not clear what these different levels, what areas of life they sort of rule over, what the spheres of these levels of perception are, what levels of consciousness they're associated with, what is the scope of the different levels of the horoscope. Because the thing is, a horoscope is supposed to do what a scope does. Horoscope literally means time scope, which basically means that you're using time as a lens to observe patterns through and to make accurate predictions using those patterns. So you can't view the world through 10 different pairs of binoculars at the same time, 10 different scopes at the same time. You have to view the world through one at a time. And each of these different rings, these different levels of perception of the star chart, are basically, you could think of them as different scopes, as different lenses to look at the structure of how we interact with time through. So in the last video I talked about the seventh layer, which is associated with the planetary hours, which is associated, it changes once every hour. The hours change on a seven-fold basis every day of the week. And that's where we get our days of the week from. They basically cycle over the planetary hours, and the days of the week are intimately tied to the planetary hours. And the reason that the planetary hours are very unstable, chaotic, fast-paced, and Mars-ruled, and sort of associated with sort of mythical symbols of demons and sins and whatnot, like lust, pride, greed, gluttony, all these things, is because the seventh layer basically represents an extreme fixation on the material. And if you recall, we start from the fourth layer, which was my first video here in this series, which is basically an animal state of consciousness where you're going around consuming compulsively with no real rhyme or reason. In the fifth layer, you begin to understand the set of your desires, the full group of all of your desires that you were unconsciously acting out. This is the level of consciousness that separates humans from animals, because animals, no matter how intelligent they are, they never get the ability to reflect and abstract on the nature of what they want. They just compulsively go from place to place doing their thing, and are sort of not pre-programmed, but they're led by their next immediate impulse. Whereas humans can look at the set of all impulses, which is to some degree expressed in the patterns of the star chart, of the signs and planets and whatnot, and can make a representation of that to a greater or lesser degree of accuracy, and therefore understand and master their unconscious impulses. And the sixth layer, which comes from the house system, which is basically another ring that's very similar to the sign system that's overlaid on top of it. And the sixth layer also represents the aspects, which are basically different combinations of signs and houses together viewed simultaneously. It is a place where you realize that all of your desires are in conflict. They're like a bunch of different sub-personalities that all want their own thing, and they don't necessarily have to get along. And this inherent conflict in the human mind it sort of ramps up into the point where you start identifying with your desires in an even more intense way. And in my last video on the seventh layer, I compared this to what the old alchemists called it, which is heating up. Mars is like a fiery red planet. It's the heating of metal. And I said that heating process of your mind can either result in a new level of catalyzed identity, more stable, higher level that takes all of the contradictions into account, or it can sort of regress back into the fifth layer, and then the process will effectively start over again because you haven't understood that lesson, that the lesson of the fourth through seventh layers. So the eighth layer will not be, you won't get to that point. So what is the eighth layer? So the eighth layer is ruled by Saturn. The colors associated with it and the materials associated with it are sort of gray, stone. It's the cooling of the heated metal. So it's not the metal that never went through the heat of transformation and self-analysis and, all of this criticism of your inherent unconscious nature, or analysis of your inherent unconscious nature. It is the metal that is cooling down after being heated up. And if you think about the process that heated that up to begin with, it was an intense analysis of desire, an intense analysis of your fundamental drives that we're all born with, an attempt to reconcile the contradictions between those fundamental drives, like, for instance, just the whatever contradictions exist between your fundamental drives, and it's an attempt to reconcile that. And the most important feature of the eighth layer is, instead of identifying with one's sort of inborn impulses that they came into this world with, every creature has them, animals all the way up to people, just that people are aware of them. They start interacting more with taking other people into account, and they start identifying more with social obligation. Because the thing is, if you're alone, right, like if you have no people around you and you don't have to interact with society at all, identifying with your desires isn't necessarily bad. It's confusing and maybe a little bit disorienting, but it's not necessarily, nobody's going to stop you from being selfish, basically. And in the eighth layer, you realize that this, Venus having these desires in yourself, the image of Venus in yourself having these desires, and Mars, which is basically the active force that goes out to achieve these desires, internalized, and Neptune, which represents the conflict between all these different desires, this sort of flood of information, this contradictory information. In the eighth layer, you realize that the most important thing that's keeping you integrated is actually not your desires, it's other people. It's the people around you, and it's the society that you live in. And the eighth layer represents a new stable state, in the same way that people can identify with their desires for quite a long time and never question the contradictions, never look at the contradictions, never breach that sixth layer sort of shadow side of this world of desires, or this level of perception of desires. And in the same way, the eighth layer represents sort of a resting place, where you can identify with your social obligations and your social experiences for a long time. Now, the eighth layer specifically represents Capricorn, which is the sign of, laws and order and natural laws and society and all these things, rules, limitations, all that stuff. And there are some inherent problems with it, which leads to, the 9th and 10th and 11th and all this layer. But the eighth layer represents a resting place, a place where you have sort of come to terms with the contradictory nature of your desires and the personal transformation that follows from attempting to claim all that you feel you deserve and need, and sort of encountering the limitless nature of human desire. And then you start to understand the sort of codependent or social nature of the human being. And because of that, there is a peace that one finds here. Now, as I said, this is not the highest level of awareness, and many people have some of these eighth layer aspects of their consciousness already, because it's the kind of thing that makes you a citizen, it makes you an employee, it makes you a person who has a structure, who has a routine. And the level of analysis associated with the eighth layer is the week. So whereas the level of analysis associated with the seventh layer was the hour, the individual hours that compose the week in their cyclical nature, the eighth layer is the week itself. So this is where we get things like, the 40-hour work week, people who, it's like you wake up on Monday, you go do this, you go do that, thank God it's Friday, TGIF, you get to embrace that fifth layer sort of mindset where you, because obviously Friday is the day of Venus, it's Freya's day and whatnot. So once you understand these layers of perception, you start understanding why the institutions and the days of the week and whatnot are set up in the way that they are. A lot of cultural phenomena starts making sense to you. And if you look at people who live in this eighth layer space, you'll find they don't wear a lot of bright colors. They don't wear a lot of like pastels or bright reds or anything, which would be associated with Mars and Venus. They wear a lot of beige, a lot of khaki, a lot of like earth tones, a lot of gray and whatnot. And those are all colors associated with Saturn in the eighth layer. Saturn is an earthy planet. It is a stone. So, yeah, all of this symbolism, you can find it in society at large. And once you understand it, you start gaining a greater understanding of the levels of perception and what people are up to, consciously or unconsciously, whether they know it or not. Now, this being said, I feel a need to rephrase something I've already said, which is that the layer system is not something where you just climb up and get to the top and look down on everyone. The layer system is a thing that we all are going up and down chronically. Our levels of perception shift depending on various things, but ultimately, once we start understanding the levels of perception, we can tune our predictions and our adjustments to the right level of analysis and not identify with any one level of perception. So it's not a hierarchy where the top is good and the bottom is bad. It's more like I said, like different levels of scopes that you are looking at the world through. And so the scope that has the most detailed or the most high resolution is not necessarily the best one, in the same way that a telescope isn't any better than a microscope. They're just used for looking at different things, and in the same way, these layers are used for looking at different things. So don't, take pride in any of these levels of perception, try to like climb up the higher layer of perception. Simply acknowledge them for what they are, know which ones are stable, know which ones are unstable, spend time looking through the scope that you need when you need it, and adjust your perceptions accordingly. With this being said, the next video will be on the ninth layer, and I will see you then.